Broadcasting from the Bryant neighborhood on the historic Black South Side of Minneapolis. Welcome to People Power.
Welcome to People Power, speaking truth to power by bringing you voices from the grassroots. My name is Merjan, I'm your host. Thank you for joining me for episode number 4. And there's so much to cover in season 2. I hope I can cover it all. Let's jump right into the people's updates. And the world knows by now that on April 11th, Sunday afternoon, Brooklyn Center police shot and killed 20-year-old Daunte Wright, who was an unarmed black youth in Brooklyn Center. He was driving his brand new car that his mother just bought him on his way to get a car wash. And he was pulled over for his air freshener that was hanging from his rearview mirror. And, the officer shot and killed Daunte as he tried to get away. He jumped back in his car and tried to drive away, and shot and killed him. So there was a press conference. Immediately, the body cam footage was released with audio, which is unprecedented to see a body cam from a police officer released within 24 hours. And it seems like this is the first time in Minnesota that we've seen body cam footage released with audio. That seems rare if that has ever happened here on the local level. But of course, protests erupted immediately after the killing of Daunte. Protesters began at the intersection where police killed him in Brooklyn Center. By nightfall, they had moved to the Brooklyn Center Police Department, where we saw law enforcement out in full riot gear. Eventually, the National Guard was called in. We saw a police tank driving through the streets of Brooklyn Center. And according to the many live streams, we saw snipers on the roof, police using flashbang grenades at the crowd. They sprayed tear gas all into the crowd. They were shooting people, including journalists, with rubber bullets. We did see some protesters shooting off fireworks into the air, but it was reported that they were not shooting them at the police, as seen in past protests here in Minneapolis. But the scene was described as a war zone last night at Brooklyn Center.
The Brooklyn Center police officer who murdered Daunte Wright has been identified as 26-year veteran Kim Potter. Activists are taking to Twitter and Facebook to call for Potters to be charged with first-degree murder. Here's Nakima Levy-Armstrong on Democracy Now! On Tuesday morning.
Yeah, so let me be clear about the fact that with this woman, Kim Potter, being a 26-year veteran, there is absolutely no plausible way that she mistook a gun for a taser or her taser for a gun. It's just unfathomable that she would even make that excuse.
And here's Jelani Hussain, Executive Director of CARE Minnesota, Council on American Islamic Relations, commenting on Democracy Now!
And as you said, the evening, peaceful protesters standing outside the police station, not a single person, I was one of the few people there early, not a single person was even on the sidewalk of the police department until nearly 50 officers came with riot gear. And many of them had been planning for this because of the Chauvin trial. This was already plans that they had. They came out, started to agitate protesters. And God forbid there was a major accident because they were literally firing flashbangs and other types of projectiles at an apartment building where children were in their home, literally no regards for children, no regards for the families that even lived across the police department. A dangerous scene.
And despite, the press conference with the mayor, the city manager, and the police chief of Brooklyn Center, we saw the chief, Tim Gannon, characterize the protests as riots, right? He was checked by the black press for mischaracterizing what we saw as people power, true power in the streets, right? It seemed mostly peaceful. I know there were reports of looting of the Walmart in Brooklyn Center, as well as other stores here in South Minneapolis. That was to be expected, right? Everybody has been waiting for the city to erupt again. The powers that be have done nothing to improve the conditions of Black people who are suffering the most. So I'll be speaking to the homie Nico from Unicorn Riot real soon. I'll be bringing you an entire episode about the murder of Daunte Wright by Brooklyn Center Police. So I created this graphic to demonstrate the cycle of the brutal surveillance state. 21st century policing is rooted in surveillance, also referred to as intelligence-led policing. I participated in a panel last week on fusion centers hosted by Restore the Fourth Minnesota, an advocacy group that advocates for Fourth Amendment privacy rights as they have been trampled on by the government, especially since 9/11. And so, I don't know much about fusion centers, but I was invited to be on the panel because of my extensive writing on the public-private partnership here in Minneapolis and the creation of the downtown fusion center, which is very different than the federal fusion centers. But what I learned is every fusion center is different from the next, according to sociologist Brendan McQuaid, who I got a chance to chat with a little bit before the panel and a little bit after. He's helped create and push a bill in Maine to defund and dismantle their fusion center after they reported that law enforcement collected an illegal registry on gun owners in the state of Maine. That pissed off a lot of civil libertarians, and there is a lot of support from Republicans and Democrats in Maine. So they're expecting that legislation to pass. We're working on some folks here in the state of Minnesota to introduce that bill. The governor, Tim Walz, is expected to, they're pushing, and he's expected to sign a bill to increase funding here of our fusion center for $2 million. So I'll talk more about fusion centers. I got a whole episode I'll be bringing, that panel discussion and what I've learned in the recent research that I've done here in downtown Minneapolis between the public-private partnership between Target Corporation and law enforcement. Check out Mel Reeves' coverage of the Chauvin trial in Minnesota's oldest Black newspaper, the Spokesman-Recorder. I spoke with Mel last Thursday about the trial and his piece called Chief Describes an MPD Unrecognizable to Many Minneapolis Blacks. I have that interview with Mel here after updates. The third week of the Derek Chauvin murder trial resumed. The defense began by requesting to have the jury sequestered due to the civil unrest in the wake of the Brooklyn Center police murder of Daunte Wright. Judge Cahill denied this motion and made clear these are two very different cases, and the only reason he would grant jury sequestration is in the case of jury tampering, if anyone outside the jury pool is trying to influence jurors. We saw a cardiologist testify for the state. He unequivocally eliminated heart attack and overdose as cause of death. Judge Cahill, he reviewed the motion to mandate the testimony of Maurice Hall by the defense, but Cahill denied the motion. He cited that the testimony would be inadmissible because it was unnecessary for the defense to make its case, according to the judge. We also saw George Floyd's younger brother take to the stand today. Villainese, he reflected on playing games growing up with George. He described George as a community leader and a caregiver for his siblings. We also saw an expert testify on police use of force. He's a former police officer and a legal expert, and he testified on behalf of the state and also concluded that Chauvin's force on May 25th, when he pressed his knee to George Floyd's neck, killing him, was unnecessary. It has been reported that closing arguments are expected for next Monday, April 19th. So I had a recap of last week's highlights and what to expect in the remaining days here in week 3 and next week. And let's break down week 2 for you. I'm going to encourage you all to check out Unicorn Riot's coverage of the Derek Chauvin trial. They've been live streaming it and providing background information and the breaks going back to last year's uprisings after the murder of George Floyd. The coverage has been really dope, and shout out to Unicorn Riot, Nico Dan. They're always first on the ground here in Minneapolis. Where whether it's a police killing or some sort of protest, they're covering it. So last week on Monday, the Derek Chauvin trial resumed with the testimony of MPD Chief Madera Arredondo. He took the stand and he stated unequivocally that Chauvin violated MPD policy when he killed George Floyd with his knee in Floyd's neck. If it wasn't clear before his testimony, it should be very clear now that MPD is most definitely making Chauvin the scapegoat. They are throwing him under the bus to ensure Chauvin is tried as a rogue officer rather than having MPD itself on trial, right? Rather than the world seeing that Chauvin is actually not the exception. The powers that be have a world stage. This was demonstrated when they awarded the $27 million settlement. That was pure propaganda. I talked to a cat last week who tried to make the argument that the city was looking out for the Floyd family. If that was the case, then why didn't they, make that settlement before the trial even started, right? The Floyd family was negotiating with the city. We know through past negotiations how the city negotiates with black family, right? They gave Jamar Clark's family 1% of what they awarded the white family of Justine Demond. They gave her $20 million. They gave Clark's family $200,000. So we could only imagine that the city of Minneapolis, under city attorney, former Target executive Jim Rorador, they were trying to lowball the Floyd family, right? And they finally realized that it's in their best interest to settle this with the world watching, and they could position themselves as champions of racial equity, which of course everybody here knows it could be nothing further from the truth, right? So Arredondo's role is to make viewers forget that Floyd was murdered under his leadership, along with Delal Eid and others. Viewers outside of Minneapolis are in the dark about the facts that MPD officers are still using chokeholds, as demonstrated recently with the violent eviction of a homeless encampment in near North Minneapolis. Also in week 2, the controversial diagnosis of excited delirium was brought to the world's attention. This was invented by law enforcement to cover for their crimes against humanity. I'll do a whole show on excited delirium. It requires unpacking. There's an article by the Star Tribune that I'll have to break down, but Dr. Langenfeld, who received George Floyd at the hospital on May 25th, before officially pronouncing him dead, he described in exhaustive detail the various technical medical attempts made to save George Floyd's life, according to Unicorn Riot. Says he saw no reports indicating any sort of drug overdose. He brought up the controversial diagnosis, excited delirium, which was created by Jeffrey Ho. Real quickly, there's an article from 2019 in the Star Tribune called Where Law and Medicine Collide. The title itself is misleading. It should be called Where Law Enforcement and Medicine Collide, because Jeffrey Ho has no legal expertise. He is a medical doctor who moonlights as a police officer. He does not have a lawyer background. Here's a quote from the article. Ho's dual allegiances to medicine and policing collided last summer when investigators from the Minneapolis Department of Civil Rights discovered that police officers were urging paramedics to sedate emotionally disturbed people in the field with the powerful sedative ketamine. Some patients were then enrolled without their consent in an HCM study of ketamine, on which Ho was a lead researcher, end quote. And I have so much to tell you about that study. It goes back at least to 2012, right? They were experimenting on homeless youth in downtown Minneapolis, the same youth I've been reporting on through Unicorn Riot. So like I said, we'll have to have a whole episode to break that down. So I'll include the link in the description. Just make sure you open it in incognito window to get past the paywall. It took me several tries. So on Tuesday, Maurice Hall, the passenger of Floyd's car, and the man who gave Floyd the fake $20 bill, pled the Fifth Amendment on grounds of refusing to incriminate himself. Several other officers in week 2 also condemned Chauvin's use of force, including MPD Lieutenant Johnny Murcell, MPD Sergeant Kerr Yang. They brought in LAPD Sergeant Jody Stinger. While he was on the stand during cross-examination, the defense played a soundbite from the video where it appeared where George Floyd was saying, "I ate too many drugs." But Stinger said he did not hear that. Later, they called special agent from the BCA, the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, James Ryerson, to the stand, and he was asked about the soundbite. After he heard an extended version of what George Floyd was saying, Ryerson said he heard, "I ain't do no drugs," instead of "I ate too many drugs." World-renowned pulmonologist Dr. Martin Tobin was called in by the state. His medical expertise is in obstructed breathing. He gave a very compelling testimony on Thursday. While speaking to the jury, he showed the court numerous visual presentations, including a 3D video and dozens of graphs and slides. He clearly stated that he felt George Floyd died from lack of oxygen from the officer's knee and Floyd's neck, while the others kept Floyd's body pressed against the pavement, leaving little room for oxygen. Eventually, Floyd ran out due to the officer's actions, Dr. Tobin testified. They also brought in forensic toxicologist who testified on Thursday. He told the court that the low levels of meth and fentanyl found in Floyd's body was comparatively lower than average levels found in DUI meth cases. So he disputed the defense's case that Floyd died from an overdose. They also brought in forensics expert Dr. Bill Smock. He said there was no evidence to prove that George Floyd passed away from a drug overdose or a heart attack or any other heart condition at the time of death. He said CPR should have been administered immediately after Floyd lost consciousness. Forensic pathologist Dr. Lindsay Thomas testified Friday. Thomas said she agreed with the medical examiner's findings. She believed Floyd's asphyxia and cardiopulmonary arrest, not a heart attack, caused his death. She adds it was because of police restraint and compression of his neck. Dr. Thomas said that, in her opinion, the activities of law enforcement officers caused Floyd's death. The defense asked if there were no police and no drugs, what would Dr. Thomas's conclusion be if he was found dead in his apartment? And she said that she would probably rule his high blood pressure as the cause of death. She said if drugs were the only aspect present, then she would consider it. That week concluded with the testimony of the medical examiner, Dr. Baker, who did the autopsy of George Floyd. Dr. Baker read the cause out loud and said he still agrees how injury occurred. Descendant experienced a cardiopulmonary arrest while being restrained by law enforcement officers. Dr. Baker didn't believe that drugs in Floyd's system were direct causes of his death. Mel Reeves said on Twitter, "The medical examiner was not a good witness for the prosecutor. I wonder why not. He actually helped the defense. Could it be because his office and the prosecutor's office usual go-to move is to help prove the innocence of the cops?" The medical examiner conceded when cross-examined by defense that Floyd's heart and drugs played a role indirectly to his cause of death. So, Mel, he's making a good point that, it wasn't a slam dunk testimony, perhaps the state may have thought. At the end of that day, it was also reported by Unicorn Riot that one juror was confronted by the judge about being influenced by a relative via text messages, about the trial. And, this suggests that the government is monitoring all communications of the jurors. I'll leave a link in the description for Unicorn Riot's coverage of the Chauvin murder trial. Make sure you check it out. They give that local raw perspective on the ground in Minneapolis through live stream and written stories. Shout out to Nico, to Dan, to the other good folks, covering all the important things in Minneapolis and other places around the country and world. After week 1, these questions came up, and I covered this in my last episode, sponsored by The Uptake. So make sure you check that out, featuring an interview I did with a lawyer and executive director of Common Cause Minnesota, Anastasia Belladonna Carrera. And so these questions, they came up after week 1. Why didn't Chauvin tell his boss he used, the chokehold or the knee on the neck move when he immediately called his boss the night of? What role did the man in the passenger seat of Floyd's car, Maurice Hall, play in the events that led to Floyd's death? So today, the judge ruled that Hall would not be allowed to testify, citing relevance, right? He claimed that Hall will not add anything to the defense. Therefore, by not allowing his testimony, he's not taking away anything from the defense from making their case. And will the state put Chauvin's background on trial like the defense is doing George Floyd? And, again, that was addressed so far. The state clearly has no plans of putting Chauvin's background on trial because in turn it would expose MPD and the city of Minneapolis. Chauvin was a field training officer with 26 reports of misconduct, including 3 other officer-involved killings. Chauvin was the rule, not the exception, and MPD and the city is going to lengths to keep this from the world. So that is why we see the chief and other police management take to the stand and all unequivocally condemn Chauvin's use of force. Why did MPD say Floyd had drugs in his system immediately following his death, before official results came in, and how did they know? Will the defense try one last time to paint a broader, more damaging picture for MPD? We should look for this in week 3, right? Because the defense, they're going to call their witnesses and try to close this out and refute the state's compelling witnesses. And then, finally, we need to look to see if the defense is going to put Lieutenant Tim Matson on the stand, who was the supervisor on duty that night at the 3rd Precinct. Tim Matson is Sergeant Pluger's supervisor, who had Pluger meet with Chauvin and King the night they murdered George Floyd. Will the unrest affect these final days, or will there be any surprises? Perhaps the defense will introduce evidence to suggest that Chauvin's behavior was the norm. Here's my interview from last week with Mel Reeves, community editor of the Spokesman-Recorder newspaper and freedom fighter, activist. You're always going to see Mel on the ground, front and center at the protests, especially when police kill one of ours. Check it out. This is from last Thursday. Mel was in the courtroom on Wednesday of last week. He was also at the protest yesterday, immediately following the killing of Daunte Wright.
All right. We got longtime activist, black freedom fighter Mel Reeves, who was also the community editor of Minnesota's oldest black newspaper, the Spokesman-Recorder. Welcome to the People Power Podcast, brother.
Thanks for having me, man.
Yesterday, you were in the courtroom. Tell us what it was like being there in person. It was a very dramatic day. What's it like versus the rest of us watching it at home?
It's not much different. You just get to see the jurors. But it's a strange feeling. Like I said yesterday in my sum up, which I posted on Facebook this morning. It feels real sanitized. It doesn't feel like a normal courtroom, which I think in the long haul may actually benefit the defense because it feels real sanitized. And, you don't get a sense of, when trial, like a murder trial, there's a lot of emotion around it because these are the family of people who've been murdered are there. And, a lot of folks are there out of curiosity and, you can look who's and all of this. The emotional thing is there. So the emotion is taken out of this. And the tension sometimes in the air, all of that's kind of taken out. So it feels real sanitized.
That's a good point. That only serves to benefit the defendant, huh? So it was a dramatic day yesterday, man. The defense bringing up that clip in the part in the video trying to imply that Floyd said he swallowed drugs. Can you break it down real quick?
Yeah, well, he didn't say it. It sounded like they came up with this idea. He said, I ate some drugs. Turns out he was saying, no, I didn't do no drugs. They said, he said, I ate some drugs. So you couldn't really make out what he said, but what's interesting was that when a defense attorney Nelson introduced it the first time, the guy on the stand from the BCA, his name I can't think of right now, He kind of said, no, actually, yeah. So he tried it with the Steiger, Sergeant Steiger said, no, that's not what it sounds like. And so it still wasn't clear what he said. But then with the next witness, the DCA agent, he asked him if that's what it sounded like said. And then he kind of said, well, yeah, it could. And then the prosecution came up, and they broke it down, and they asked him again. They played it again for him. And they said, that's not what it sounded like. And he said, no, it's more sounded like, I ain't do no drugs, what he said. You know, they try everything. They're trying everything. Anything, everything. That's why I call the lawyer a mercenary. I mean, you know, he's got a job to do. He gets paid to do a job. That's part of what happens in the U.S. But, you know, there's some things you kind of don't want to do if you can help it. But think about it. You know, mass murderers have lawyers. So,
right.
But this feels really egregious. So,
right.
You know.
So let's talk about your piece last night, man. The title was nice and plain, and a lot of folks were waiting for that to drop, including myself. But with the headline, it was Chief describes an MPD unrecognizable to many Minneapolis blacks. Say more.
Well, you know, the article pretty much says it all. You know, we those who watched it, you know, heard the chief talking about a police force that you know, we don't recognize. You know, he was talking about how they see themselves as servants and that they understand that even when going on a call, what really struck me is that we know that people are going through things. So when we approach them and when we respond, we want to do it in a professional manner, in a manner that's kind of caring. I don't remember the exact words, but it really hit me that, you know, he described
sanctity of life was the term he used, right?
Caring police department said something about, you know, we want to make sure that the community benefits from our service, and you know the way he laid it on thick. And listening to it, it's like, no, man, that's not the police department we usually run into. You know, no doubt there are some cops that you know treat folks differently. I mean, there are some cops who I've run into who actually treat people humanely, and that's appreciated. You know, but it's a little bit beyond the point, because as I point out all the time, the problem is the system of policing. Even some of the so-called good cops don't really understand the real role they serve, which is to reinforce all the stereotypes in the society, as well as, you know, help keep black and brown folks and immigrants and anybody else who's unpopular in their place. You know, they're first line of defense for the folks in power. And most people don't understand that's why we still run around to my good cops and bad cops. It doesn't really matter, especially if you're getting your butt kicked and the good cops are there watching. See, that good cop idea would hold true if, one, the police administration would fire and discipline the so-called bad cops, and two, if the so-called good cops would turn in the so-called bad cops or intervene on occasion. And that almost never happens.
Right.
So, yeah, you know, the cops that he was describing are not the police that we know. You know, these kinder, gentler cops, you know, these cops who respond professionally and caring. You know, that's not what people see. Usually police respond, a lot of times they respond, even just a simple thing. You know, they got an attitude, you know, they're a little rude, and don't actually be in a real conversation with them. Then it's, then it's the F word here, and F word, and F you this, and you know, it's like, you know, they're like a little gang sometimes. Or they respond to an incident, you know, you ask them a question, you know, you get all this rudeness. Somebody got killed on 35th in Chicago not long after George Floyd. It might be a few months after George. I happened to be on 38th in Chicago. I walked down to where the kid got killed, and the tape wasn't up. And so I didn't think to take a picture when I first got there. So before they were going to put the tape up, I thought, well, hey, man, let me get a picture. So just when I'm about to get the picture, the cop goes, oh, man, we're going to put the tape together. I go, well, give me a second. Let me just take the picture. So now, he could have easily given me a second to take the picture, right? But here's what they're really all about. No, I can't do it. No, you gotta move on down the rest of us. I'm already here, guys. No, because the bottom line is he is in charge. He's boss. The cop shows up. They let you know that they're boss. They represent the power structure. They're power. And so you have to comply. That's the whole thing. If they say something to you, they're not yielding because they understand their role is to make you comply. You complying is the same as you complying with the power structure. That's what that's. That's why they roll up on you. That's why they kill so many people. Kill people who can't comply. And so anyway, so I said, all right. So I started to walk back. One of his superiors, I guess, heard us, and he decided And I said something smart to him. He said something smart. So then he called me a child. And I said, nobody's more childlike than you guys that wear the blue. You should have seen it. Under different circumstances, he would probably try to come grab me or something, but I was too far away for one. but that's the real police, simple discussion. Hey, man, can I take this picture? No. Dude, why can't you let me in the chairs or something like that? So that's those guys. They're always bullying people. So what are you talking about? This ain't true. Nobody knows what he's talking about.
Right.
Nobody's seen those guys.
Well,
anyway, that's a good point. But
well, and to that point, that tells me that Minneapolis knows exactly what to do with this world stage, right? They got the chief up there, for people who live outside of Minnesota. This is a police department that sounds progressive. You forget the same department and the same chief that, oversaw the murder of George Floyd and Dalal Eid. So that reminds me of this Washington Post opinion op-ed piece that talked about this being a missed opportunity, right, to put policing on trial. Do you see this as a missed opportunity?
The system is on trial. It keeps showing you how the police operate, like the video from the police camera or whatever camera it was that showed the whole video that captures the initial encounter with George Floyd. What's his name? Thomas Lane pulls a gun on George Floyd. Like you said in your editorial, but they pulled a gun on him, right? And then they pulled the gun. The passengers were treated like criminals. They might have done something, but you got to give them the benefit of the doubt. They were asked for ID, put up against the wall, and even Floyd himself. The cops said they were arresting him for forgery. Dude, this is all about a counterfeit bill. How do you go from a counterfeit bill to forgery? So the whole thing is on trial. Then you see these cops rough this man up and don't let him off of him, kill him. And then you see this guy walk away and like it's no big deal. So, the system of policing is totally on trial here. So I don't think this is an opportunity. They don't see it as an opportunity because what they're trying to do is, like you just said, that they're trying to distance themselves from this guy, from Chauvin and saying he's an aberration, he's an exception rather than rule. But he's closer to the rule than the exception, as we know. It may not be quite the rule, but there's a whole lot of cops that run around roughing folks up. So, they want to distance themselves. There's a propaganda, like I said before. They want to distance themselves from him. Even one of the Washington Post articles was saying that the thin blue wall of silence is being crossed. No, it hasn't. This is the upper management doing that. So, this may have been an opportunity for them, but obviously they're not taking advantage of it, and they don't see it as an opportunity to do anything better. You don't see them doing that. You haven't seen any city that roll out some new ways in which to keep the police accountable, or some way in which the police accountable. So nothing has changed, man.
So to you and I, policing is on trial, right? But obviously the powers that be are trying to say, no, Derek Chauvin is a rogue cop. They got they got the chief, they got upper management on the stand saying he's a rogue cop, right? They don't want policing on trial. So the city is using this as an opportunity to actually showcase Minneapolis as a progressive force, right? They're showcasing 21st century policing, which really is rooted in surveillance. And Minneapolis has been a pilot city with the safe zone surveillance camera in downtown. I don't know if you read my piece in Unicorn Riot, but that's what I'm getting at. Policing should be on trial, but it's not, right? Because the chief is on the stand along with his cohort, all saying Chauvin violated policy. Well, you and I know he was a field training officer, right?
Right. That's the point I'm making. That's just not true. That Chauvin is not an aberration, not an exception. There's a lot of guys like Chauvin on the force, so they're just throwing Chauvin under the bus, like my article says, so they can cover themselves. But it does not change the way they operate. It doesn't say that they changed anything. Policing has not changed. Nothing's changed. All that's changed is that Chauvin murdered George Floyd in the public eye. Everybody saw it, so they couldn't sweep it under the rug. Because had Darnell Frazier not recorded it, it's very likely that no big fuss about it. His family might have inquired about how he died, and they would sweep it under the rug. That's what they, in fact, when they do an investigation, what they're really doing is trying to cover their butt. That's, they make a big deal about, we do this like they did the trial. We go through this procedure. All those procedures are designed to help the cops cover up what they did, as we've seen in case after case after case with Terrence and Jamar Clark. You saw it. Their first move is to cover their own butt. So that's what that's all about.
So from a community perspective, for folks out here, we want justice, and we don't want the city to burn, but many people expect the city to burn if there's going to be an acquittal. So what should we look for in these last couple weeks as this trial comes to a close?
Well, they're going to try George Floyd. That's going to happen. George Floyd's going to be put on trial. He's already been put on trial on some level. So what's going to happen is George Floyd is going to be put on trial. Is what's going to happen over the next 2 weeks. I imagine the trial to go another maybe a week and a half, 2 weeks.
Well, so Mel, you got this national platform right now. The world is watching Minneapolis, and you being with the Spokesman, one of the oldest Black newspaper in Minnesota. Make sure you're out here. We're counting on you to tell the full story, right? You and I both know this is bigger than George Floyd, as you mentioned, Jamar Clark, Terrence Franklin, just to name two. But I've been reporting and trying to bring light the voices of Black youth who've been brutalized by police downtown, and this whole racket that Target has been leading. It's an important backstory, my brother. So we're looking for you and the Spokesman-Recorder to help tell that full story. And I appreciate your time this morning, Mel. I definitely hope to have you back, brother.
I appreciate it, man. Yeah, we're gonna tell the best we can, brother.
All right.
Keep telling it.
All right.
Keep telling it.
Keep speaking truth, brother. Appreciate you, Mel.
Brother.
Take care.
All right, man.
The state is clearly banking on expert testimony. They are refusing to put Derek Chauvin's background on trial. So if they lose, there's plenty of reasons why people are going to blame the state for throwing the case. And, the judge, he's made many whack rulings giving favor to Chauvin, many folks believe. But if you see this in the perspective that I do, the state is trying to make Chauvin a scapegoat. The defense and the judge know this, so they're walking a fine line. The judge, I should say, he's walking a fine line. The state is walking a fine line to say that, Chauvin got a fair trial. He got the trial that he deserved. And no matter what, if, Chauvin loses, expect the defense to file for an appeal. That's just standard. That's my time for today. Like I said, I will be dropping links to all of today's coverage in the description below. Make sure you check them out. Shout out to the Uptake for sponsoring episode 4 and episode 3. Please check out episode 3 featuring my interview with Anastasia Belladonna Carrera and the recap of week 1 of the Derek Chauvin murder trial. I'll be back real soon with my interview with Nico from Unicorn Riot, and we will go in depth about what we know of the murder of Daunte Wright by Brooklyn Center Police. And also I got a special episode coming soon on Fusion Center, so look for those. And as always, be safe. Make sure you wear your mask when you're in public. Practice responsible protesting while out in the streets. Remember, there still is a pandemic raging. Let's take care of one another. All power to the people who organize. Peace.